We are delighted to have here today Marina Bykova, who is professor of philosophy at North Carolina State University and the editor-in-chief of the philosophical journal Studies in East European Thought and Russian Studies in Philosophy. Her main area of specialization is the history of the 19th century continental philosophy with a focus on German idealism, especially on Fichte and Hegel. Her most recent books include The German Idealism Reader, Ideas, Responses and Legacies by Bloomsbury, 2019, Hegel's Philosophy of Spirit, A Critical Guide, Cambridge University Press, 2019, the Bloomsbury Handbook of Fichte, edited book by Bloomsbury 2020, and the Palgrave Hegel Handbook co-edited with Go Westphal, Palgrave, Macmillan, 2020. She has also published books on Russian intellectual tradition, which she will cover today in her presentation, including recently appeared Philosophical Thought in Russia in the second half of the 20th century, Contemporary Views from Russia and Abroad, which is co-edited with Lektorsky and published by Bloomsbury 2019. And she has also published the Palgrave Handbook of Russian Thought with Forster and Steiner. In addition to books, she is the author of more than 200 research articles published in English, German, and Russian. Professor Bykova was awarded a prestigious Aleksanteri von Humboldt Fellowship and named Lisa Meitner Fellow. She has also held fellowships at the University of Marburg, Germany, University of Zurich, Switzerland, University of Vienna, Austria, and Ohio State University, United States. And now she is with us today. Please, Marina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So thanks a lot, Markku, for this nice presentation. Thank you to everybody for coming. Today, the weather is beautiful. It's time to be outside, and I really appreciate that everybody is here. So the topic of my talk today, so it's written here. So I will be talking about Russian state and Russian philosophy from 1922 deportations to today's struggles. In 1922, Vladimir Lenin personally drafted a list of undesirable intellectuals, mostly academics, scientists, philosophers, and journalists, to be deported from the new Soviet state. I quote, "We are going to cleanse Russia once and for all," so he wrote to Stalin, whose job was to oversee the deportation. 3 ships, 2 German vessels that sailed from Petrograd that fall, and 1 Italian ship that departed from Sevastopol in the beginning of winter, took Russia's eminent intellectuals and their families away to what would become their permanent exile in Berlin, Prague, and Paris. It's somehow ironic that in the year of the centennial celebration of this event, known to historians by the name of the philosophical steamer, we witnessed another dramatic exodus of the Russian intelligentsia that again has been forced to leave the country and flee tyranny that banishes reason and anything associated with freedom and free thought. Leaving aside the question of the humanitarian justification of both expulsions of Russian intelligentsia, in this paper, I focus on the most controversial issue in Russian intellectual history, the relation between state power and thought, which lies at the heart of both the 1922 deportation of the most talented thinkers and the 2022-23 mass exodus of Russian intellectuals. Only 9 out of about 53 representatives of intelligentsia expelled from Soviet Russia in 1922 were professional philosophers. Yet given the unprecedented level Russian philosophy achieved in pre-revolutionary years, when in fact it was not writers but philosophers who would increasingly become the spiritual leaders and shape the nation's thoughts, the name philosophical steamer comes to refer to the entire group of the steamship passengers and in general to all publicly active Russian intelligentsia forced to leave the country because they refused to comply with the dictatorial regime. The philosophical schema, as a proper noun, thus became a symbol of the authorities' intolerance toward dissent and the unwillingness of these dissidents to abandon their freedom in all its forms and dimensions. In this sense, a phenomenon of the philosophical schema emerges as an embodiment of the antagonism that characterizes the relation between the state and philosophy in Russia. It illustrates and symbolizes an unresolvable confrontation between power and thought in Soviet and now post-Soviet Russia. In what follows, I examine the oppressive role played by the Soviet and post-Soviet state in recent and current Russian intellectual history, mainly by focusing on the country's philosophical life during several of its most turbulent periods since the October Revolution. I first examine important events leading to the deportation of 1922. I then consider specific actions undertaken by the current regime directed toward the philosophical and broader intellectual community of liberal political and social orientation, and that impose severe restrictions on intellectual freedoms, essentially undercutting and virtually banning freedom of thought and expression. I will conclude by offering some thoughts about the unique nature and character of the antagonism between Putin's regime and thought, and reflect on reasons for the open opposition to genuine philosophy and generally any free thought in contemporary Russia. I will argue that at the core of the present hostility against free thought lies an attempt of the Russian political elite to institute a new official ideology to be used as an instrument to force the country back to archaism and, using terminology of the sociologist Lev Gudkov, I quote, to recurring totalitarianism. This ideology is also to justify the ongoing war in Ukraine, glorifying as just, defensive, liberating, and patriotic character. This ideology consists in historical, cultural, and religious myth, invented traditions, as well as harsh feelings of resentment. The central link between this ideology and the war is the imperial idea culminating in Putin's repeated description of Russia as a state civilization, which by its nature absorbs smaller cultures such as Ukraine's and perhaps others. To be sure, there is nothing new in this ideology. It's almost literally borrowed from the times of Stalinism and even earlier Eurasian and Slavophil narratives. It's being regenerated to legitimize the authoritarian regime and simultaneously to delegitimize all those who oppose the regime and do not share the regime's views of reality. A culture of hatred toward everything declared alien and everybody having a distinct opinion, a fundamental intolerance to otherness, both beyond the country's borders and within, is upheld by this ideology. In this milieu, any original idea or position differing from the official view is inherently illicit, hence there is no place for an independent thought or genuine philosophy. The only philosophy compatible with such a culture is what the state adopts as its ideology. Philosophy is then made utterly servile, and the love of power overrules the love of wisdom. We saw this in the Soviet Union, where Marxist philosophy claimed a universalistic monopoly on ideological truth. In its unlimited dominion, it became equivalent to madness, dealing ruthlessly both with those who indulge in philosophy and with individual thinkers engaged in philosophical studies. Almost 2 centuries ago, Hegel warned, I quote, "What experience and history teach is this, that nations and governments have never learned anything from history, nor acted upon any lessons they might have drawn from it," the end of quote. This is from his lectures on philosophy of history. What we now witness in Russia appears to be a great illustration of Hegel's observation. I now turn to my first section, pre-thought and period. Lenin's deportation of philosophers and intellectuals in 1922, so hasty and lacking any well-developed plan, nevertheless was not at all random event, with obvious origins in the Bolshevik struggle for ideological supremacy. Indeed, the philosophers destined to exile disagreed radically with the nascent yet even more powerful Russian Marxism. Whereas in the last decade of the 19th century, Russian philosophical thought was largely associated with legal and so-called critical Marxism, at the turn of the century, it broke with this tradition, scrutinizing the pseudo-religious roots of Marxism and its largely abstract and apparently contradictory character. Sergei Bulgakov's collection of articles spanning from 1896 to 1903 depicts the agonizing divorce from Marxism many Russian thinkers went through. This collection has become emblematic of an entire era of the Russian intelligentsia. Its characteristic title, From Marxism to Idealism, perfectly describes the transition made by many Russian thinkers of that period. Another significant collection, Problems of Idealism, including articles by Bulgakov, Struve, Berdyaev, Frank, and other key philosophical figures of the epoch, not only demonstrates their adherence to idealism, but clearly signals the author's vigorous rejection of the dictatorship of the proletariat and the socialist transformations taking place in Russia. Early in 1922, the authorities launched a monthly philosophical and socio-economic journal, Под знаменем Marxisma, under the banner of Marxism, largely to present arguments directly opposing ideas advanced by the author from Marxism to idealism. Henceforth, anyone who proposed non-Marxist theories of history and society and thus questioned the legitimacy of the authorities became subject to shuddering criticism and often defamation in the pages of this journal. Its third March issue published a programmatic article entitled On the Significance of Militant Materialism that sets an agenda for developing methods to combat ideological enemies. Written by Lenin, the article aimed to criticize Peter Sorokin's paper on the influence of war on the composition of the population, its properties, and public organization, shortly before published in the journal Economist. In concluding his critique, Lenin announces for the first time his intention to expel, how he puts it, members of learned societies labeled as suspicious counter-revolutionary elements. He wrote, I quote, "The working class of Russia proved able to win power, but it has not yet learned to utilize it. For otherwise, it would have long ago very politely dispatched such teachers and members of learned societies to countries with a bourgeois democracy. This is the proper place for such federalists, but it will learn, given the will to learn," end of quote. It becomes clear that the offensive on the ideological front is now associated with the idea of expelling those members of the intelligentsia whom the authorities found objectionable, primary university professors. It would soon be implemented. Interestingly, the same journal issue that published Lenin's work included an article by the journal's editor-in-chief Vaganyan, titled Scientific Obscurantism, directed against Lev Karsavin, then a professor at the University of St. Petersburg. Karsavin was certainly not the only one subjected to the militant criticism of the emergent Bolshevik Inquisition. Another passenger of the philosophical steamer, Semyon Frank, published an essay on social science methodology, which attracted the critical attention of Lenin himself, who was among the first to read this piece. Many believe that this very essay was a reason for Lenin to include Frank on the list of deportees. The publication of the collection Oswald Spengler and the Decline of Europe marked another very important event in the philosophical life of that period, which also didn't pass without trace. Not only did the collection's first printing of 10,000 copies sell out in less than 2 weeks, but its publication also put questions of Western modernity and its historical calling into focus, leading to heated debate. In addition to Frank, among the contributors, Sean Berdyaev, Stepun, as well as the economist Yakov Buchka. The contributions by Berdyaev and Stepun were based on papers they delivered at seminars of the Free Academy of Spiritual Culture and at meetings organized by the Religious Philosophical Academy. The sessions offered by Free Academy, initiated by Berdyaev in 1990, drew packed houses. As Berdyaev himself recalled in his memoirs during a paper devoted to Spengler's book, I quote, "There was such an extraordinary crowd that some people had to remain in the street. The stairs were blocked, and I was barely able to enter the room. There was a great cognitive thirst," he writes, "a demand for free thought," end of quote. The collection drew increasing interest of the authorities. In a secret note dated March 5th, 1922, Lenin labeled it a literary cover for a white guard organization. The increasing confrontation with philosophers and other thinkers who refused to curb their freedom of thought and expression was met by the authorities with fear and hatred and impelled them to quick action. In a secret note to Felix Dzerzhinsky in May 1922, Lenin writes about the deportation as of a decision that has been already made. I quote, "Comrade Dzerzhinsky, on the issue of expelling writers and professors who aid the counter-revolution, we need to prepare this very thoroughly. There are all obvious counter-revolutionaries, accomplices of the intent, an organization of its servants and spies, and characters of school-going earth. Things must be set up in such a way that these military spies are caught, and they need to be caught constantly and systematically and sent abroad," end of quote. In a few short months, this decision turned into a decree implemented successfully. The dramatic ideological confrontation between the dictatorial force of a new Russian state and thought thirsty for freedom ended by expelling those who dared to oppose the state and challenge its authoritarian power. The Russian scholar Sergei Polovinkin reports about a survey of deportees carried out on board of one of the steamers. Asked about the reasons for his expulsion, Nikolai Losky responded, I quote, "Not for political deeds. I have not committed any in 5 years. So I'm being expelled from Russia just as I was expelled from Petrograd University a year ago, faulted only for my religious philosophical views," end of quote. The reason all these exiles were denounced is obvious. They consider socialism a false doctrine and progress toward communism a pseudoscience. They openly opposed the new dogmatic ideology, which made them counter-revolutionaries to the regime. The authorities viewed their largely idealistic and religious worldview as dubious and dangerous. Moreover, since the majority of deportees taught at key universities around the country, exposure to their ideas was perceived as a substantial threat, especially regarding the immature minds of university students that could be easily corrupted. In essence, in Russia, the exiles faced a complete ban on their profession and denial of the intellectual freedom and their right to independent inquiry, all due to ideological reasons. However, the very fact that they were deported rather than shot or exiled to Siberia came to a rather happy end. Banned banned from publishing in Russia and silenced in their country for nearly 70 years, the passengers of the philosophical steamer continued working abroad on their philosophical and religious projects, where they engaged in academic and scholarly activities in the various forms, from publishing books and journals to organizing scholarly centers and educational institutions. In addition to producing a large corpus of work that earning worldwide recognition, they came to symbolize the persistence of freedom and resistance to mental slavery. I am now turning to the next section of my paper, A New Attack. Shockingly, today, 100 years later, philosophy and free thought in Russia are again in danger, and the Russian intelligentsia flee the country in droves. In its significance, consequences, and impact on the intellectual life in Russia, the current Putin-induced exodus is perhaps even larger than that in 1922, when Soviet authorities evicted a total of 228 individuals, including some of country's most famous and productive thinkers. Russia is now experiencing the largest exodus since the October Revolution of 1917, and the majority of those living belong to the intellectual and cultural elite. According to just recent data available, so to everybody free, about 1.3 million people left Russia only in 2022. To be sure, the list of today's exiles includes not only members of the intellectual elite, but also an entire educated middle class. And while not all of them might be openly opposing the Putin regime and the war he unleashed in Ukraine, they live being afraid to be strangled by the regime and stripped of possibility to realize themselves. There is also persistent fear of closed borders, which is somehow ingrained in the historical memory of those familiar with the history of the Soviet Union. As they live, they know that they may not be welcomed anywhere, since abroad they are often associated with Putin's regime, even though they may have been fighting against it. Yet those who stay behind are far from being better off, as they struggle to redefine their lives. Indeed, the fate of today's Russian intelligentsia is not less disastrous than it was a century ago, when Nikolai Berdyaev wrote in Russian Idea, I quote, "It's a property of the Russian people to indulge in philosophy. But the fate of the philosopher in Russia is painful and tragic," end of quote. The regime's grip on power not only remains firm, but becomes even more terrifying. In this sense, claims by some top Russian experts, for example, Angela Stent, that, I quote her, Putin's grip on power has slipped because of Russia's mounting failures in Ukraine. So such claims are far from accurate. Within the country, the regime has drastically increased its power and ideological control over political, social, cultural, and all other, even basic forms of life. The more the war against Ukraine falls further into disarray, the more despotic and tyrannical the regime becomes. In its desperation to solidify the validity of its absolute power, it makes one long for basic rights to express oneself, to move freely, to choose one's own fate. It would certainly be exaggerated to claim that the intellectual atmosphere of today's Russia is identical to the suffocation experienced under the imperial reign of the Nicholas I, when every independent thought was met with police crackdown, every free spirit faced ostracism and repression. Yet it's coming very, very close, trust me. There are striking similarities between then and now, and in how authorities handle a variety of social and political issues, including denial of basic human rights, absolute control of the state over education, official courses on nationalism, which forcefully promote certain traditional values, and most important, the emerging insistence on the official state ideology. While detailing parallels between the two epochs is beyond the scope of this paper, I mention some relevant similarities below. First, I focus on recent clashes between the Russian intelligentsia and the regime that I find very, very revealing. A few specific incidents should suffice to illustrate the aggravated character of the current conflict between power and thought in Russia. The first incident goes back to December 2021, but it's closely related to the current social situation in Russia, which prohibits free thought in all forms of expression. The incident is a conflict arising at the Russian Academy of Sciences Institute of Philosophy in Moscow, when the institute director was appointed by authorities in violation of existing rules. According to the bylaw that regulates the appointment procedures within the Russian Academy of Sciences, the director of a research institute is elected by one of the research associates employed by the relevant institute. The elected individual shall then be approved by the upper administration within the academy itself. The institute closely followed this procedure when it re-elected its previous director, academician Andrei Smirnov, who for several months served as an interim director awaiting the required approval. Yet on December 20th, 2021, the Russian Ministry of Education and Science that formally overviews the activity of the academy appointed as the institute director Dr. Anatoly Chernyaev, who was not even on the ballot for this position. This decision of the ministry was not discussed with any official representatives of the upper administration within the academy. Then president of the Russian Academy of Sciences, Sergeyev, learned of this scandalous decision of the ministry from external sources. As it turned out, despite the candidacy of Smirnov having passed all required approval procedures, a representative of the Putin administration stopped the appointment without explanation. Instead, the ministry was empowered to install another candidate named by the authorities, prompting a stunning backlash from the institute. The institute was truly outraged by the decision that stripped it of its rights to elect its director, which it regarded as directly attacking academic freedom. Furthermore, the ministerial candidate, Chernyaev, is a staff member of the institute who was recently dismissed from his post as the head of the Department of Russian Philosophy and deputy director of the institute, having been found unsuitable for a leadership position. In speaking to a meeting of the Alexander Zinoviev Club on November 29, 2021, Chernyaev publicly denounced the research activities of the institute as anti-patriotic, pro-Western, and leveled ideological charges against the institution as a whole. The Zinoviev Club is politically associated with an ultra-right public movement, Tsargrad, founded and led by the Russian ultra-conservative oligarch, monarchist Konstantin Malafeyev, who sponsors several pro-Kremlin Orthodox and ultra-conservative projects. In addition to his several positions within some ultra-right organizations and nationalistic movements, Malafeyev currently serves as the deputy head of the World Russian People's Council, formed by the Russian Orthodox Church, with Patriarch Kirill at the wheel. Malafeyev also linked to the security services, and he is very close to Putin himself. In recent conversation with the host of the talk show, Dайте сказать, Let Me Speak, Malafeyev openly defends the ideas of the imperial consciousness, how he puts it, and claims, I quote, that such a big state cannot live without ideology. Our traditional values should become a central core, end of quote. The media group, Tsargrad, which he, Malafeyev, owns, has repeatedly attacked the Institute of Philosophy, labeling it a heaven for Western-oriented liberals. By now, there is no doubt that Malafeyev and his organization was behind the incident. Also, in response to the institute protest, Chernyaev was quickly removed by the ministry from the directorship, and the institute's former head, who retired 5 years ago, was appointed as an interim director for the coming year, disinformation attacks unleashed by Malafeyev's arduous media against the Institute, its leadership, and key researchers quickly spread to other ultra-right press. It's worth mentioning that the Academy's Institute of Philosophy has been the object of harassment by a number of ultra-patriotic media for more than 2 years now. The campaign began with Federal News Agency controlled by Yevgeny Prigozhin, a Russian oligarch and a close confidant of Putin. This is the same person who is infamous Wagner founder and chief. In March 2021, his news agency published an article accusing the Institute of Philosophy of conducting ideological subversion. According to the authors of the article, I quote, "Under the guise of a liberal worldview, Khodorkovsky and Soros agents are stubbornly trying to poison Russian society with their ideological miasmas at the state's expense," end of quote. It's proved to be just the beginning, though. Today, the attacks on the Institute and its affiliated members continue and intensify, exacerbated by political repressions and a totalizing effort to criminalize all voices that deviate from the regime's propaganda machine, what Orwell sardonically called the Ministry of Truth. For example, in January 2023, the infamous Sargrad published a piece under a very telling title, "Philosophia от Иуды. Предательство русского мира академиками. Philosophy from Judas, Betrayal of the Russian World by Academicians." The lengthy material accused the Institute of engaging in subversive activities again. The general leitmotif of the accusation in this and other subsequent publications and YouTube videos is the cooperation of philosophers with foreign organizations and funding agencies, such as the Soros Foundation, in the study of foreign philosophy. In December 2022, the Russian Ministry of Justice declared the head of the Institute Ethics Department and one of the Russian key ethicists, Ruben Apresian, a foreign agent. A scholar of a high caliber working in the area of the non-violence ethics, Apresian never participated in any opposition to the state. It was a truly unprecedented move. Even during Stalin's great purges and political repressions coincided with the Brezhnev era, the authorities persecuted for dissent and political activism and not for philosophical ideas and theories. Now, the state and authorities declared the war against freedom of thought and philosophical expression. The press released by the pro-government Russian media justified this outrageous decision in the following way. I quote, "The decision to deem Ruben Apresian a foreign agent is a part of the strategic decision made by the state that aims at launching the process of sovereignization of Russia's ideological sphere and preventing the Western expansion of ideas and values into our territory of meaning and senses." End of quote. Try to make sense of that. This was yet another dramatic turn of the political vendetta against the Institute initiated by Malafeyev and other ultra-conservative organizations in service of the state. Philosopher propagandist Alexander Dugin, the Zinoviev Club, the newspaper Zavtra, and other conservative media joined in the attacks. The developments described above have strongly suggested that the incident with the appointing the Institute director was not at all random. It served as the regime's warning to the Institute about who is in control and what will happen to those who disobey, who continue collaborating with the West and exercising free thought. Other recent events pointing to dramatic escalation of the conflict between the Russian state and intellectuals include constantly increasing governmental censorship of intellectual creativity and expression in speaking and press, firing professors for opposing the war in Ukraine, closing academic programs, as well as reorganizing departments and faculties with reputations for open and forward-looking institutions. One such example is Petersburg State University's Faculty of Liberal Arts and Sciences, known informally as Smolny College. which for more than 2 decades successfully collaborated with liberal arts Bard College, the US, that in 2021 was declared an undesirable organization, representing, according to Russia's Justice Ministry, a threat to the foundations of Russia's constitutional order, undoubtedly through reading ancient authors and teaching classic languages. Smolny itself has been targeted in numerous attacks by the Russian authorities. After firing key faculty members, its existence as an educational institution now threatened. In March 2023, Russia's Prosecutor General's office declared an undesirable organization another reputable educational institution, Moscow's Free University, established in 2020 by a group of faculty members fired from one of the Russia's top schools, the High School of Economics, for their improper way of thinking. Prohibited to teach in Russia, they organized a university register in Latvia, in Riga. In almost 3 years of its existence, the Free University has grown significantly from offering only a few classes to a full curriculum consisting of dozens of lecture courses, seminars, and labs. More than 100 instructors joined the force, and it had attracted a large number of students at both undergraduate and graduate levels. Claiming that the students enrolled in the institution, I quote, form a strong hostility towards Russia and the ultra-liberal model of European democracy is forced on them, end of quote. The authorities declared the university and its mission, another quote, a threat to the foundations of the constitutional order, territorial integrity, and the state security of Russia, end of quote. Labeling undesirable by the Kremlin, de facto made the operation of the institution virtually impossible, which forced the Free University to suspend its activities in Russia. Those are not isolated examples, though. All of academia is now under strong political pressure regarding curriculum, educational activities, and research. The war in Ukraine, unleashed by the regime, only further aggravated and heightened the contradiction-ridden relations between the state's officials and those intellectuals who have steadfastly opposed the state. The large-scale military and political conflict in Ukraine is viewed in official circles as a socio-cultural confrontation between Russia and the West, which raises the question of state ideology. Until recently, philosophy somehow slipped under the government and its political ideological radar. Now, authorities turn their attention to philosophical institutions, demanding the development of a special philosophy, how they put it, that doesn't repeat its Western counterpart, but would instead provide a firm foundation for a new state ideology. Until recently, most notably, during the first and start of the second term of Putin's presidency, his administration insisted that Russia needs no state ideology. Presenting the strategy for Russia at the turn of the millennium, Putin argued against the restoration of any official ideology. I quote, as an undemocratic Russia, he said, there should be no coercive public consensus, end of quote. He clearly presented himself as fundamentally non-ideological, claiming to be working solely in line with technocratic objectives. Even when he returned to the presidency in 2012, and his conservative posture became prominent in political and social affairs, it was not officially recognized as an ideology. Furthermore, the new, now current Russian constitution, adopted in December 1993, expressly forbids the existence of a dominant official ideology. However, current developments have focused the issue of producing a state ideology. A couple years ago, the Kremlin would be satisfied with a kind of cocktail of ideological offerings, including such diverse ideas as Eurasianism, Pan-Slavism, the Russian world theory, a rigorously anti-Western attitude, a so-called white agenda shaped by references to Tsarist Russia, Orthodox Christianity, and the white immigrants, among others. Today, the Kremlin is absorbed by the need to produce a new doctrine almost in the style of defunct Marxism-Leninism. Until this year, the ideological offerings focused on shaping the population's worldview, and such instruments as controlling media in all its forms, including TV, press, and the internet, served this purpose well. After invading Ukraine, and especially the failures of Putin's Ukraine agenda, ideological pronouncements by the regime exposed an explicit tension between apparently inconsistent principles resulting from combining inherently contradictory ideas and agendas. This explains the need for a well-formulated state ideology to organize all these ideas into a systematic whole. Putin's recent speeches also strongly emphasize the importance of a consensus values in Russian society and politics. This he aims to achieve by introducing a new state ideology. Apparently, the most important role in producing this ideology is assigned to philosophy and the humanities. In fact, this is a new attempt to again turn philosophy into ideology. However odd it may sound, this new ideology is not all new though. It is archaic in both content and form. A preview of its key elements is provided by discussion at the recent 24th World Russian People's Council, October 2022, that not only insisted on, I quote, the importance of creating a state ideology for the preservation of Russian statehood, but they also took some practical steps toward realizing this goal. The Council agreed on a basic model focused on three ideas: faith, family, and fatherland. This ultra-conservative model is well known and ever present in Russian history. The proposal to systematize and codify this ideology led to forming a team charged with the duty to prepare a special ideological course, how they put it, to be required for all students attending Russian universities, tentatively titled Fundamentals of Russian Statehood. Interestingly enough, a similar course existed in Soviet times. A most boring and useless discipline, so I studied it, known as scientific communism, научный коммунизм, that students in all institutions of higher education across all majors must pass to satisfy their degree requirements. A senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Andrei Kolesnikov, jokes that perhaps, by analogy, the new course should be labeled scientific Putinism, which would make much sense, especially when we look at its components. According to its creators, the course should consist of 4 key blocks: history, culture, codes, Russia in the world, and an image of Russia's future. The first is nothing other than historical politics, Russian history rewritten to conform to the political demands of an increasingly controlling regime. Creating a new historical narrative draws upon a long, and I note highly successful, tradition of Soviet myth-making. The expected result is a highly mythologized official version of history. As its title suggests, the second block stresses the traditional spirit and moral value as defined by the state. These are to become the cultural codes that, like biological codes, must be transformed from generation to generation. Russia in the world is to justify isolationism, so isolation of Russia, anti-Westernism, and national superiority. The content of the fourth block, an image of Russia's future, remains unspecified though. A trajectory of Russia's future is obviously murky. Accepting immediate goals of defeating Ukraine and destroying the so-called fifth column, intelligentsia, national traitors, who according to Putin pose an existential threat to Russia. Other than that, no consensus has yet been reached regarding what the state is to do and where it should be going. This task appears to be largely delegated to philosophy. It is not to say that a designated philosophical think tank can escape involvement in creative work, realizing goals for the three other blocks. But given the undeveloped state and the far-reaching character of the fourth, this is the very mission of state philosophy. This official state philosophy still needs to be produced, though. But I would not be surprised to see, and very soon, a new legion of true patriots ready to recast the narrative of Russian philosophical thought and intellectual tradition in general, in strict accord with the state mandate. One needs no expertise on Russia to see how the new state order being established by Putin's regime harks back to the darkest times in its bloody history. This is true not only of a grim new era of repression and toughness, punishment for opponents of the regime, it is also visible in the state's collaboration with the Orthodox Church, the ongoing patriotism campaign, and a high-stake bet on extreme ethno-nationalism. Reference to Russian history is also informative for understanding the key ideas to be validated today as a new official state ideology. Ideological control over education is nothing new. Recall the official nationality as government ideology announced in 1823 by Sergei Uvarov, who, as newly appointed Minister of Education, proclaimed that all education in Russia must be conducted in the joint spirit of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. Today's regime may use slightly different vocabulary, but the key ideas remain absolutely the same. Putin's ambitions for Russia involve nothing new. Neither is remaking Russia in any productive way on his list. Rather, his only program is returning to strong and glorious Russia. Putin and his close political circles' primary goal is regime survival. This defines their domestic politics. There are many striking commonalities between Stalin and Putin's regimes. For example, both are ultra-nationalistic. Some scholars even call them national Bolshevism. Both are based upon the idea of historical and ideological continuity for Great Russia, attempting to integrate past and present in Russian history. Yet while Stalin's was a future-looking attempt to build a strong totalitarian state, ready for challenges and fully confident in its abilities and accomplishments, recall Soviet military inventions, the exploration of cosmos, real achievements in education, etc., Putin's is not at all concerned with the future. Obsessed with the preservation of the status quo, it seeks its own legitimization in the past. This has implications for the regime's selection of historical images and their interpretation and presentation through propaganda, as well as the choice of core ideas upon which to build a not so new ideology. Clearly, Russian intellectuals shall soon confront again a difficult choice, either to swear allegiance to the regime, leave the country, or enter inner immigration. There is no place for freedom of thought under this authoritarian regime and its tyranny. I turn to conclusion. Aristotle warned us that truth is to be desired and pursued only for its own sake, or for the sake of gaining knowledge, not for any benefit derived from it. This applies especially to philosophy because it addresses understanding the world as a whole and its most general laws. Thus, any attempt to follow uncritically the dictates of prevailing circumstances, conform to the dominant political views, or blindly adhere to traditions undermine the very essence and mission of philosophy. A poet can still write a good ode to the glory of a sovereign or patron, but a philosopher who submits his thought to a will of an influential official, wealthy patron, or an ideological or commercial mandate betrays his freedom and his profession. This is a failure of philosophy, a betrayal of its mission, and a failure of character. The best that the state can do for philosophers is allow them intellectual independence and the freedom of professional self-determination, and also self-assessment. Otherwise, Pseudo-philosophy only degenerates into empty ideologisms, thought constructions, not at all supported by reality, which undermine the very idea of philosophical insight, understanding, and creativity. Philosophers and other practitioners of the intellectual professions should be guided in their choice by the criteria of wisdom itself, that is, by the highest goals of their own disciplines, not by directives commanded from on high, be it by the state, the censor, the inquisitor, or any appointed official. Political and opportunistic interests cannot and should not prevail in scholarly and creative activities. Research, including philosophical research, must be free from coercive influence by political and ideological trends and ambitions. Thank you.